Today, I want to talk about how, when it comes to doing theology, where you start really matters. Sometimes, if you talk to people about theological convictions, you get the sense that sometimes we think about them as being like these things that kind of float around and we can gather them up and arrange them however we want and put them together however we want. You get the sense from time to time that people want to talk about their theology as if they built it like a buffet line, where you take all the things that you want and you leave aside anything that you don't want. I've known people who have said things like, well, I don't really believe that, but they don't realize it's implied by everything else they believe. Other times, you'll hear people make it seem as though two people have arrived at the same conviction, even though they got at it from two very, very different perspectives. It seems like it's a variation on this idea of truth is truth regardless of where it comes from. But again, that's a bit misleading. What I want to point out here is that where you start your thinking makes a difference. And at least sometimes you might need to rethink where you're starting from if you want all of your thinking to make sense. Let me give you an example of this kind of thing. A while back, I was involved in a certification process for online teaching and learning. And one of the aspects of that certification process was a section on the importance of being very deliberate about developing online community for Christian education. And so we had to read a whole bunch of things, and we had to write a reflection paper about building Christian community and how the online medium can either help it or hinder it. Now, if you were to ask me what I thought the central biblical and theological images are when talking about Christian community, I would tell you it's things like the vine and the branches from John 15, and the church as the body of Christ that we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And theologically, I would argue that the concept of the Trinity should be vital in our thinking. The thing is, those ideas were all missing from all of our reading, with one small exception. The instructor had shared with us some of his own work, where he did at least try to bring the Trinity to bear on his reflections, but that only served to highlight how absent it was in all the rest of our reading. In the midst of it all, I was just struck by how can we possibly be talking about Christian community if we're not at least in some way grappling with these themes and ideas. And it was all the more confusing to me because in the midst of this absence, there would be a quotation from like one random verse in the middle of the Psalms that was meant to be conclusive proof for something. I just couldn't understand how this could possibly be happening. Now, this all started to make more sense when I realized that basically all of our reading drew our attention back to the rule of St. Benedict as its primary source and inspiration. Because you see, this rule that formed the basis for the Benedictine monasteries and others seems to use scripture in this same way. It became increasingly clear to me that the reason that so much of this literature was silent on these topics is because the rule of St. Benedict was silent on these topics. It's really hard to overstate how much influence these foundational texts can have on the traditions that spring from them. Another example, and a bit of a less sinister one, has to do with my experience in academic work. When I'm reading people who are somewhat close to my areas of research interest, I find myself agreeing in the areas where we overlap, but then I think the implications mean we should go this way, and they think that the implications mean we should go some other way. To be clear, none of this is a bad thing. None of us are going to think the same way, and we're all going to think that the implications of what we see lead us in different directions. The point I want to make is that where we come from and how we approach an issue really does make a difference for our way of thinking. Now, say you come to somebody like the theologian T.F. Torrance from a position like I do, which is I'm interested in theological things, but I'm mostly interested in how he takes a deep dive into interactions with philosophers and scientists. I'm going to be interested in different things. I'm going to ask different questions than you might if you primarily come to Torrance because you find him helpful with debates that were founded and shaped by medieval thinkers. Neither one of them is bad. It's just that where we start from and what we're interested in makes a difference. Now, there are clearly some implications about where we start from that are really nothing more than preference. I mean, I start from here rather than there because this is where I am right now. How can I start from somewhere else if this is where I am now? I don't want to make it seem like the stakes for where we start on are so high that we stop ourselves from even getting going because we're not certain that we're in the right spot. However, there are some ways that starting in the wrong place could not only have intellectual difficulties for us today now, but also they could theoretically ripple throughout time for hundreds of years. For example, suppose that you were to do what so many people before us have done and try to think about God in terms of what God must be like in order to be worthy of the title God. In that case, that God would have to be the perfect being. Well, what would that mean? Classically, it has meant that God has to be all-knowing because any being that doesn't know everything could always be surprised or overcome by something that they didn't know. Also, it means that God would have to be all-powerful because anything that can be overpowered certainly couldn't be considered God. And also, then, the God would have to be all-good because any being that's not entirely good is not worthy of being worshipped as God. Well, that all may sound fine in the abstract as long as we don't try to play it out with consequences in real life. The problems arise the moment we look to Jesus. Classical Christianity has taught us that Jesus is God in flesh with us. But the thing is, there's lots of places in the Gospels that portray Jesus as something other than what we would construct as the perfect being. For example, Jesus talks about not knowing some things. We see Jesus asking God, things like, if it is possible. And he says some things from time to time that don't necessarily always seem loving, at least from a 21st century American perspective. What do we do with the fact that Jesus, we say, is God, and yet doesn't look like the perfect being that we have constructed? Well, the classical explanation is Jesus is kind of putting on something like a show. Jesus is saying all these things, but that's not really who he is. The thing is, the moment we do that, we're saying that Jesus is an unreliable source of knowledge about God, that we have to take something that we think we know from somewhere else and use that as our basis to then reinterpret Jesus in the light of it. But what this does is it builds an unavoidable tension into the center of our thinking, because we want to say, on the one hand, that Jesus really is God and we need to listen to him, and yet that we also reserve the right to stand in judgment over what we see in Jesus based on information and authorities we've derived from somewhere else. Of course, I think it's possible for Christians to believe that God is all-powerful and all-good and all-knowing and all the rest. It's just we have to define those terms based on what we see in Jesus, and we don't build their meaning based on what we thought they had to mean before we ever looked at Jesus. Now, from my perspective, there are two major reasons why we need to keep our starting place in mind, and keep in mind how it affects our thinking, even though both of these things have implications. The first one has to do with how we interact with other people. Now, if we're not being aware of our starting place, we may hear other people and think that they believe very different things than we do, when we're really not that far from each other because we express ourselves differently because we came at the issue from a different angle. We might think that we're at war with them when really we're not far at all. However, it might also mean that we encounter someone who believes very different things than we do and not notice it because we're using similar words and expressions. We might think we're walking down the very same road, but we might actually be about very different things. The more dramatic reason why we need to be aware of where we're starting and be prepared to change that starting place if we discover that we need to is because it's possible that there are some things we simply cannot see if we're looking at them from the wrong starting place or from the wrong angle. The history of science is absolutely full of examples of when some old way of thinking got in the way of our seeing things in a new way. For example, there was a time before we understood and knew about oxygen that we thought that the reason things burn was because of a substance inside of the burning thing called phlogiston, and that it gave it off as it burned and went into the air, and when the air got too much phlogiston in it, it could no longer support burning. Another example is that Newtonian physics cannot explain why the orbit of Mercury seems to be rotating over time. It was treated as a mystery or an anomaly that couldn't be solved. Relativity theory explains why it happens, but it requires us starting from a new point of view. The same thing is true in theology. Sometimes we can't see what's there, not because it's a mystery, not because it's hidden, but because we're looking at it from the wrong location. Sometimes when we're confused, we don't just need more information, we need an entirely new way of seeing things. So when you interact with somebody and they just don't seem to be making sense, try to see things the way that they see them. Try to stand where they're standing and see the world the way they do. You do that and you may find you still disagree, but at least if you've done that, you may find you can have a more productive conversation. Well, that's all for today. If you have any questions or topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.